It just hit 9:32. You're still tuned in to Salam Media, and we're going to be delving into a significant discussion with Professor Daryl Glaser. He's a professor at Wits University and an expert in political studies. We'll be exploring the topic of, well, to me, what seems to be false allegations of white genocide. I'm not sure if you stay in South Africa or in any part of our country, if you have, experienced or seen what you might consider white genocide happening. I know these allegations are set against the backdrop of farm attacks, and our aim is to unravel the complexities and gain insight into this narrative surrounding this issue. Without further ado, let's welcome Professor Daryl Glaser to Salam Media. Prof, thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to the show.
I'm very pleased to be with you and your viewers and listeners.
I think, this issue, and I think it's been a hashtag that's been doing the rounds on Twitter, I think for the larger part of last year, hashtag white genocide. A lot of, sects of South African society are claiming that there's a white genocide currently happening in the country. How do these narratives and incidences shape the country when it comes to social cohesion and just how South Africa is viewed internationally by other countries?
Look, I think there are several things that have to be separated out here. I mean, the first thing to say is there's no white genocide in South Africa, as you yourself said in your introduction. I mean, genocide involves some systematic, organized set of attacks on a particular population group, and there's scant to zero evidence of any such thing going on in South Africa directed against whites or any other population group. I mean, if any population group has come close to appearing to be the victim of something genocidal, it's perhaps foreigners. In some of the sort of genocide, in some of the sort of xenophobic pogroms, but even there, I think it doesn't qualify as genocide as such. But having said that, you've got two factors here. On the one side, you've got South Africa's incredibly violent nature, its extremely high murder rate, and compounding that, you've got rural vulnerability. So people. Farmers and their workers living in rural areas are particularly vulnerable. You've also got very poor policing in the country, policing that's arguably getting worse and worse in terms of its capacity to actually find perpetrators. So you've got that on the one side. And then on the other side, you've got politics. So you've got various people who are going to try and interpret this, and some people who are going to try and exploit the situation and make a particular kind of political publicity out of it. So you've got I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I think one can talk about a kind of a global network of right-wing commentators who are taking the situation in South Africa and interpreting it, or rather misinterpreting it, deliberately or otherwise, as a kind of genocide against white South Africans. And this does find resonance, and it affects South Africa's reputation in certain circles. I don't think this particular accusation is necessarily taken seriously universally, but certainly in conservative white circles, let's say in Australia or in the United States or in Europe, this accusation resonates. So, and on the other hand, you've also got actors inside South Africa who allege some degree of genocide. And you've got, of course, also people who use inflammatory rhetoric in this country, including against whites. So all of these things produce a combustible mix that gets exploited by certain actors.
Definitely. But you did mention that you're not a conspiracy theorist, but the first question that would come to mind is, what could be the intention of spreading such allegations, especially if you're a white South African, you stay in South Africa? granted, there are challenges, but there is still a lot of good in the country. White people are in a minority, and you know, since 1994, there hasn't been that, if any, any, loud incidences or any, portrayal of a bubbling white genocide. So I'm just trying to maybe get to the cracks of the matter. What could be the intention? What could be the goal of spreading such a, crazy allegation?
Well, look, I think we have to distinguish two different things. There are legitimate complaints and things to be said about the vulnerability of people in rural areas, about people of all races who are victims of South Africa's crime rate, of its poor policing. South Africa is a country in which about 500,000 people have been murdered since 1994. And perhaps 2,000, 3,000 or more people have been murdered on farms. So there is a general crisis of crime in this country, and there's a general crisis of rural vulnerability to crime. If you're wanting to carry out robbery, for example, elderly people living on farms are going to be tempting targets. And there may even be a political element in some cases. Some rural violence, interracial violence, is probably bound up with histories of labor exploitation, labor disputes, land disputes, and so on. I don't want to rule out the possibility that that's a factor in some cases. The statistics and the general information we have is not sufficient to enable us to pass a clear judgment about whether that's a factor. So there are legitimate complaints about that. And then on the other side, there are people who've got political agendas. So that must be separated out. So there are people who want to advance conspiracy theories. They on the white right in South Africa, but the white right globally, you could say, want to advance various versions of this argument that basically the white races or the white race in South Africa and around the world is under threat from a variety of forces of multiculturalism, of the left, of mass immigration, etc., etc. It's a central source of anxiety, a fear of loss of power and privilege and status, arguably on the part of many whites around the world. And we're in an age of social media and mass communication where these kinds of arguments can be easily communicated. These kinds of fears and anxieties can be easily fanned. So I don't want to go along with the idea that there isn't a problem here. There's a genuine problem here around crime and rural vulnerability, but then there's the separate problem of the exploitation of this issue. And you could also say it's exaggeration, basically. It's hyperbolic exaggeration by elements on the right.
Considering your expertise, how can academia play a role in, unpacking and addressing this contentious issue? In what ways can, scholarly research contribute to a more informed public discourse on white genocide allegations?
Well, I think the responsibility of academics in this situation is to gather information, to provide an impartial interpretation of information, and to point out where there's a lack of information. It's also to, observe and trace various kinds of political mobilization, including, in this case, the mobilization of the right-wing networks I've referred to. So it's to provide, as far as possible, a kind of an impartial summary and analysis. I mean, some academics take activist roles, and there's a legitimate place for activism in academia, but academics are not above all activists. We're above all scholars who are providing a kind of an interpretive and informational base on which others can operate. So our duty is to ensure that the public is as well informed as possible. Unfortunately, we're in a situation where information is often quite limited, and the basic facts of the matter, about the scale of the problem, about, for example, whether farmers in general, farm populations in general, or white farmers in particular, suffer a higher rate of murder victimhood than other sections of the population in relative terms. The information about this is quite murky. So it's the duty of academics to gather as much information as possible and to point out where there's insufficient information or where more information would be desirable. I don't think one can take the role of academics much beyond that.
Mm, mm. And are there any global examples or case studies that could provide insights into addressing similar challenges, and what lessons can South Africa draw from these experiences from other countries that have maybe have had this kind of situation before?
Well, it depends what you mean by this kind of situation. I mean, obviously, what people who are claiming genocide are trying to compare the South African situation to is other countries where there have been genocides. And people who've studied genocide argue that, genocide doesn't necessarily begin with mass killing, but it begins with a climate of incitement. And so they'll point to, perhaps things that Julius Malema has said or songs that he sung, and they'd say this contributes to a climate of incitement. So they will be pointing to their own international comparative cases. I mean, another relevant international comparison might be with the global mobilization of right-wing or white right-wing populist forces. So it depends what situation you're wanting to compare the South African one to. I think it is important for academics to have an international and comparative perspective here. And by the way, the fact that this white genocide is a myth, it doesn't mean that it's okay to sing songs which celebrate the killing of farmers. I don't want to say that that's fine because there's no genocide here. There are, as I said, there's an issue of rural vulnerability in every country where there are racial divisions and majorities and minorities. You could say minorities, even privileged ones, experience a certain degree of vulnerability. So I don't want to suggest that there should be carte blanche for incitement or the kind of frivolous use of inflammatory language. I think we have to be on guard against that because there are real dangers around that. That's also amongst the lessons of international experience, that on all sides in South Africa, we should be careful not to dehumanize the racial other or the ethnic other or the foreigner or whatever. That is important. That is a legitimate point to make about the current situation. But having said that, of course, that doesn't mean one has to concede that there's a genocidal climate in South Africa. I don't think that that is in any way an accurate description of the situation.
I would just have a quick question from one of our listeners. They're asking, would you ask the prof that would you attribute the maltreatment and dehumanization of farm workers to the killing of farmers?
Well, there's some evidence, observational and qualitative evidence that South Africa's long history of racial labor exploitation, which was particularly acute in rural areas. Rural areas are also the site of major land disputes because of the history of white land conquest. Basically, the conquest of originally black-owned or black-used land by white people historically. This creates a context which undoubtedly is going to generate certain tensions. But the extent to which these tensions around labor and land are direct contributors to the current farm violence, this is not clear. Look, I think that we can safely say it's a factor in some cases. But the police and others claim that in the majority of cases, the motive for this violence is robbery. It's kind of common crime, but you're dealing with particularly vulnerable targets, particularly tempting targets in remote rural areas.
And should there or are there consequences, for those that are peddling this agenda? Is there any way that they can be prosecuted? what is there recourse, to, I don't know, in any way mitigate this issue?
No, I mean, absolutely do not look to the constitution or to the law to try and suppress this sort of speech. This speech comes under the heading of free speech. If you're going to prosecute people for spreading claims about farm murders or white genocide, then you'd have to prosecute anyone who sings songs about killing the Boer. And in fact, that constitutes a more sort of direct and obvious incitement than claims about genocide. So, no, look, this belongs to the realm of speech and politics. These false claims of genocide have to be countered through the sorts of interviews you're doing now, through research, through political discussion, through political debate. This is part of democratic politics in South Africa. So I don't think we should be looking in any way to use the law, which is very ineffective, by the way, against farm murders and other crimes. I don't think we should be looking to use the resources, the scarce resources and ineffective resources of the law to be suppressing the free speech of citizens.
And just before I let you go, Prof, I'm not sure how closely you've been following the case, the ICJ case, maybe, a perfect example of what South Africa might consider genocide. The Israeli genocidal case that South Africa has presented at the ICJ court. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think maybe South Africa does have, a strong case, and could this maybe be used as a blueprint, maybe to bring back home, to say this is what genocide looks like, and look, it has been persecuted at the International Court of Justice?
Yes, well, I mean, what's happening in Gaza certainly presents the level of violence that Palestinian citizens or the Palestinian population in Gaza is facing provides a dramatic contrast with the level of violence that white South Africans face. White South Africans face much, much less, and the violence that white South Africans face is not clearly distinguishable from the violence that South Africans in general face in a highly violent society and crime-ridden society. Whereas, obviously, in the case of Gaza, you've got a population that has been systematically targeted, where there's the combination of massive employment of military force, massive harm to civilians, and you've got inflammatory rhetoric from various elements of the Israeli political elite. That comes together in a lethal cocktail. I mean, the ICJ will form its own view about whether that clears the bar of genocide. But I mean, certainly massive war crimes, and certainly they would have to come to the ICJ, in my view, that there's at least a risk of genocide, and some recourse is required. Some intervention on the part of the ICJ is required to stop the Israeli bombardment of Palestinians. That's a sharp contrast with the situation in South Africa, where whatever whites suffer seems to be more or less a continuation of what, or in seamless continuity with what South Africans in general suffer by way of violent crime.
All right. Professor of Political Studies at Wits University, Professor Daryl Glaser, thank you so much for giving us your time. A really insightful conversation, and we hope to speak to you soon.
Okay, no problem. Good morning, everyone.
Goodbye. That was Professor Daryl Glaser, shedding light on a very complex issue, and an issue that demands a lot of attention, in my opinion, before it just spirals out of control. Hashtag white genocide, something that has been trending a lot on my social media, and I'm sure on everyone's hashtag white genocide, everywhere you look, since the beginning of last year. Stop it, man. There's real genocide happening in Palestine right now. So you really want to take away all the attention, and all the resources that could have been used to help people that are suffering a real genocide in real time that the whole world is witnessing. And you want to bring the world's eyes here. The same country that has presented a case at the ICJ against Israel for perpetuating genocidal acts against the people of Palestine. just check the construct of the two scenarios, as the professor mentioned. Very different, what the Palestinians are going through and what I think all of South Africans are going through. I think the issue is just an issue of crime. What's happening in South Africa? It's not an issue of whites that are being targeted. It's not an issue of blacks, inciting in any way, genocide against white people. That would be preposterous. Granted, there are some dividing issues, some racial tensions that are bubbling up in our country, but I think it's a bit irresponsible to go as far as calling it a genocide. What we are experiencing and seeing in real time a genocide happening in Gaza. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll be chatting to the Secretariat of Direct Selling Association of South Africa, Mr. Imtiaz Ibrahim. We'll be talking about direct selling and how it can help matriculants and South African graduates that are suffering the brunt of youth unemployment try and make something of themselves. We're going to take a quick break. We'll see you after this.